The cold burned. That was Adrian Novak's first conscious thought as his neurons reluctantly fired back to life. Cold wasn't supposed to burn, yet here it was, searing through his veins like liquid nitrogen as the cryostasis began to reverse. Neural patterns stabilizing, a melodic voice announced from somewhere beyond the frost clouding his vision. Remarkable preservation of frontal lobe activity. Adrian tried to speak, but his vocal cords remained frozen in place. The experimental cryogenic procedure had worked then, he had survived the 50-year sleep. Soon he would see if his research had paid off, if the degenerative condition that had been slowly killing him had been halted. Careful with the thermal gradient, the voice continued. Human cellular structures are surprisingly fragile during revival. Human? The way the word was pronounced, as a classification rather than an identity, sent a chill through Adrian that had nothing to do with the cryogenic chamber. The fog across his vision began to clear, revealing a laboratory that bore no resemblance to the cryotech facility where he'd begun his experimental sleep in 2035. This room pulsed with soft bioluminescence, its architecture flowing in organic curves that defied conventional engineering. And leaning over him was definitely not Dr. Patel. The figure had humanoid features, 2 arms, 2 legs, an elegantly proportioned torso, but the similarities ended there. Her skin shimmered with an opalescent quality, catching the light in prismatic patterns. Where hair should be, delicate tendrils floated as if suspended in water, despite the normal gravity. Most striking were her eyes, large, multifaceted like an insect's, yet conveying an unmistakable intelligence as they studied him. "Hello, Adrian Novak," she said, her mouth moving in perfect synchronization with English words. "I am Lyra, xenobiologist of the Stellarian Confederation. Your vital signs indicate consciousness. Can you understand me?" Adrian managed a weak nod, his mind racing. Xenobiologist. Stellarian. This wasn't 50 years in the future. This was something else entirely. "Excellent," Lyra continued, adjusting something on a floating panel beside her. "You are experiencing temporal disorientation, which is expected. The date by your Earth calendar is approximately June 12, 12035 CE. Adrian's heart monitor spiked dramatically. 10,000 years, he finally croaked, his voice rough from millennia of disuse. Lyra's tendrils rippled in what might have been sympathy. "Yes. Your cryogenic technology was primitive but remarkably effective. Your cellular integrity remained at 97.3%, which is unprecedented for a non-augmented human. You are quite literally a living fossil." Adrian struggled to sit up, finding his muscles responding sluggishly. Why am I awake? Is Earth? Earth prospers as part of the Galactic Concord, Lyra explained, helping him to an upright position. As for why you were revived, that was by royal decree. Queen Nyx herself ordered your restoration. A queen wants to see me? Adrian asked, trying to process the impossibility of his situation. Lyra's expression shifted subtly. Not just see you. She requested you specifically, by genetic profile and historical record. You are to be presented to her as the temporal ambassador, a living bridge between ancient Earth and our current era. Adrian stared at his hands, the same hands that had once calibrated cryogenics equipment in a lab in Boston, now possibly the oldest human hands in existence. And what does this queen want from an ancient human? Lyra's multifaceted eyes gleamed with something unreadable. Queen Nyx believes you possess something her lineage requires. Something preserved in your unaltered genetic structure that could be beneficial to her bloodline. Adrian felt a new kind of chill. She wants my DNA? She wants, Lyra said carefully, to evaluate your potential as a royal consort. The royal chambers of the Stellarian flagship, Eternal Dawn, defied Adrian's expectations. Rather than the cold, sterile environment he'd anticipated from advanced aliens, the space pulsed with life. Bioluminescent organisms formed living architecture, walls that breathed, ceilings that rippled like water, and furniture that adjusted to perfectly support his unfamiliar human physiology. "Her Majesty approaches," announced an attendant, a tall, willowy being with silvery skin who had introduced himself as Thalo. "Remember the protocols Lyra taught you." Adrian straightened his posture, adjusting the ceremonial garments they'd provided, a fluid material that seemed to hover just above his skin rather than rest directly against it. After 3 days of intensive cultural briefings and medical examinations, he still felt woefully unprepared for this meeting. A section of the living wall parted like curtains, and Queen Nyx entered. Adrian had seen images during his preparation, but they failed to capture her presence. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, her form was both powerful and graceful. Unlike Lyra's opalescent coloration, the queen's skin gleamed with a deep indigo hue that shifted to violet where light struck it directly. The floating tendrils that served as hair for her species were longer, more elaborate, adorned with what appeared to be living gemstones that orbited her head like a constellation. Most captivating were her eyes. Unlike the multifaceted ones of other Stellarians, hers were strikingly humanoid but entirely black, with pinpoints of light that seemed to reflect distant stars. "Adrian Novak of ancient Earth," she spoke, her voice resonating with harmonic undertones that made his skin tingle. "You stand before us a miracle of preservation and chance." Adrian performed the greeting gesture he'd been taught, right hand over his heart, left extended palm up. "Your Majesty honors me with her presence. I am still adjusting to the reality of my situation." A sound like wind chimes emanated from the Queen. Laughter, Adrian realized. Directness. How refreshing. "My advisors warned me that humans of your era were bound by excessive social constraints." "We were," Adrian admitted, "but waking up 10 millennia in the future tends to put things in perspective." Queen Nyx approached, circling him with measured steps. "You understand why you were awakened?" "I've been told I'm to serve as a temporal ambassador, though the specifics seem rather vague." "A diplomatic phrase for a more complex arrangement," she replied, stopping directly before him. "My civilization faces a challenge. Despite our technological advancement, our genetic diversity has diminished through millennia of selective breeding. We require new elements." Adrian maintained eye contact, despite the unnerving starfield quality of her gaze. "And my prehistoric genes offer something valuable? Your species adapted rapidly during its evolution, surviving conditions that would extinguish most life forms. Our analysis of your perfectly preserved genome reveals markers of exceptional adaptive capacity that have been lost in both modern humans and our own kind." She extended a hand, hovering it near his face without touching him. "May I?" When Adrian nodded, her fingertips, warm, not cold as he'd expected, brushed his temple. A strange sensation flooded his mind, not intrusive, but like barriers dissolving. "Remarkable," she whispered. "Your neural patterns retain plasticity rarely seen in mature specimens." "Not sure if that was a compliment," Adrian said, fighting the disorientation from whatever she'd just done. The star points in her eyes seemed to flare. "It is the highest praise. You adapt quickly, think flexibly, and possess genetic resilience my lineage requires. So I'm, what? A donor? A specimen?" Nyx withdrew her hand, her expression unreadable. "My proposition is more significant. I seek a consort who will help forge a new future for both our peoples. The union would be diplomatic, genetic, and..." She paused, personal. Adrian's mouth went dry. "You're proposing marriage? To someone you just met?" "I am proposing an alliance with the most valuable biological asset in the galaxy, you." She gestured, and the room transformed, projecting three-dimensional star charts around them. Humanity has spread to these systems, but remains fractured politically. The Stellarian Confederation controls these regions. Together, we could unite them. Adrian stared at the cosmic map, realizing the scale of what she suggested. This seems like a lot for someone who still hasn't figured out your plumbing systems. Another chime-like laugh. You will have time to adjust. To learn. To decide. And if I decline? Her expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. You would remain an honored guest and historical consultant. But the opportunity to shape galactic policy would be limited. Politics, Adrian thought wryly. Some things hadn't changed in 10,000 years. I'll consider your offer, Your Majesty. Nix nodded, seemingly pleased. Wise. Thalo will show you to your permanent quarters. Tomorrow, you begin integration training. As she turned to leave, Adrian called out, one question. She paused, looking back. Of all the humans who must have been cryogenically preserved. Why me specifically? The Queen's tendrils swirled in a pattern he couldn't interpret. Perhaps that is what you should discover for yourself, Adrian Novak. After all, few coincidences survive 10,000 years. Adrian's permanent quarters occupied an entire section of the royal wing, a sprawling suite that adapted to his preferences with unsettling accuracy. After 2 weeks of intensive integration training, learning everything from Stellarian customs to basic interstellar politics, he had begun to establish a routine. This morning, he sat cross-legged before a viewing portal that displayed Earth from orbit, its geography subtly altered from what he remembered. The sight still brought a knot to his throat. Ambassador Novak, called the ship's ambient intelligence, Professor Lyra requests entrance. Let her in, Adrian replied, standing to greet the xenobiologist who had become his most reliable guide in this new reality. Lyra entered, her tendrils arranged in what he now recognized as a formal pattern. You've been accessing the historical archives, she stated, gesturing to the holographic displays scattered around his room. Trying to fill in 10,000 years of missing context, Adrian confirmed. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose. An archaic but effective metaphor, Lyra noted with the slight ripple of her tendrils that indicated amusement. Have you found anything of interest? Adrian hesitated, then decided on directness. Actually, yes. I've been researching cryogenic preservation projects from my era. Something doesn't add up. He gestured, and the displays rearranged to show historical documents. According to these records, the facility where I was preserved suffered a catastrophic power failure in 2042. Everyone should have died when the systems failed. Lyra's multifaceted eyes reflected the holographic light. Perhaps your chamber had superior insulation? No. Adrian pulled up technical specifications. If anything, my prototype pod was more vulnerable than the commercial units. Yet somehow, I alone survived 10 millennia without power? Lyra moved closer to examine the documents. What are you suggesting? I think my preservation wasn't an accident. These records show unusual energy signatures at the facility the night of the supposed failure. Someone deliberately diverted power, made it look like a disaster, but kept my specific pod functioning. Adrian brought up another display showing financial records. And this shell company that purchased the facility ruins afterward? It traces back to an organization called Eternal Horizon, which appears in classified government documents as a black-budget project concerned with potential extraterrestrial contact. Lyra's tendrils went completely still, a sign of intense focus or concern. This is unexpected information. Is it? Adrian challenged. Because I also found this. He opened a final document, a genetic analysis comparing his DNA to modern humans. My exceptional adaptive capacity that Queen Nix is so interested in? These markers weren't natural. They were engineered. The silence stretched between them until Lyra finally spoke. You believe you were intentionally preserved and genetically modified as preparation for first contact? I think someone in my time knew, or guessed, that aliens existed and wanted to prepare an ambassador for the future. Adrian ran a hand through his hair in frustration. The question is, how did Queen Nyx know to look for me specifically? Lyra's posture changed subtly. Perhaps I should take you somewhere. The restricted archives deep within the ship required multiple security clearances, but Lyra navigated them with surprising authority. They entered a chamber filled with artifacts, some human, others distinctly alien. The Queen faces challenges you haven't been told about, Lyra explained, activating a sealed console. The Stellarian ruling council opposes her choice of you as consort. Political opposition? Biological concerns. Lyra brought up genetic diagrams. The Stellarian species is facing genetic degradation after millennia of selective breeding for psychic abilities. The royal lineage is particularly affected, each generation less viable than the last. Adrian studied the complex chromosomal displays. And my engineered resilience genes could help? That was the theory, Lyra confirmed. But there's more. She revealed another document, one bearing a symbol Adrian recognized with shock. The logo of Eternal Horizon. This was recovered from deep space 3 centuries ago, Lyra explained. A time capsule, specifically directed to the Stellarian royal family, containing coordinates to your preservation facility and your complete genetic profile. Adrian stared in disbelief. Someone from my time sent my information to aliens who wouldn't arrive for thousands of years? Yes. And the capsule contained this. Lyra produced a small crystal cube that glowed from within. A message, specifically for whoever revived you. Adrian took the cube with trembling hands. When his skin contacted the surface, it projected a holographic image of an elderly woman in early 21st century clothing. Hello, Adrian, the recording began. If you're seeing this, our greatest gamble succeeded. My name is Dr. Eleanor Novak. I'm your great-granddaughter. Adrian nearly dropped the cube. That's impossible. I never had children. The recording continued. The genetic samples you donated before your experimental cryostasis were preserved. Your son was born 20 years after your death. We continued your research across generations, eventually discovering what you theorized, that humanity is not alone. Eleanor's aged face showed fierce determination. The beings you now know as Stellarians will one day save humanity from extinction, but only if their genetic decline is reversed. You carry the solution, not just in your modified genes, but in your mind. The adaptive capacity isn't just physical, it's neural. And it's the key to everything. The hologram flickered. There's more you need to know, but the storage capacity of this medium is limited. Find my journals in the Earth Historical Archives. And Adrian, the Queen may want your genetics, but be cautious. There are factions who want humanity to remain subordinate forever. The message ended, leaving Adrian staring at the empty space where his descendant had been. The Queen has seen this? He asked quietly. Lyra's response confirmed his growing suspicion. Only parts. The Council censored what she could access. Adrian closed his hand around the crystal cube. I need to speak with Queen Nyx. Immediately. That may be difficult, Lyra said, her tendrils now arranged in what Adrian recognized as a pattern of distress. The opposition to your presence has escalated. The royal consort selection ceremony has been moved forward. The Queen must choose in 3 days, or forfeit her right to select altogether. The Stellarian High Council chamber intimidated by design. Curved walls soared hundreds of feet upward, creating a vortex-like structure that drew all attention to the central dais where Queen Nyx stood, regal and resolute. Arranged in tiered seating that spiraled the chamber's perimeter, 50 council members watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to undisguised hostility. Adrian stood at the chamber's entrance, flanked by Lyra and Thalo, awaiting formal recognition. Despite his ceremonial attire, a more elaborate version of the hovering fabric he'd worn for his first meeting with the Queen, he felt painfully human and out of place. "The temporal ambassador requests audience during closed council," announced a herald, disapproval evident in their tone. Queen Nix's gaze found Adrian immediately. "Ambassador Novak is granted voice in these proceedings. Approach." As Adrian walked the long path to the central dais, whispers rippled through the chamber. He caught fragments: primitive specimen, contamination risk, royal bloodline tainted. When he reached the Queen's side, he bowed formally before turning to address the council. "Honored representatives of the Stellarian Confederation," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I've discovered information critical to both our peoples." An elder council member rose, tendrils arranged in a pattern of objection. "This is highly irregular, Your Majesty. The human has no standing to address matters of state." "Yet he will be heard," Nix countered, her tone leaving no room for debate. "Continue, Ambassador." Adrian activated the data crystal he carried, projecting its contents for all to see. "I've uncovered evidence of a coordinated effort spanning thousands of years, beginning in my time and continuing to the present day, involving both human and Stellarian agents." The projection showed timelines, connecting documents from his era to recent Stellarian communications. "My preservation was not accidental. I was genetically modified and intentionally stored as part of a long-term plan engineered by my own descendants, working in secret coordination with elements of Stellarian society." Murmurs erupted around the chamber until the Queen raised a hand for silence. "What is the nature of this conspiracy?" she asked. "Not a conspiracy, Your Majesty. A desperate measure against an existential threat." Adrian expanded the display to show biological data. "This pathogen was documented in my descendants' records. A manufactured biological agent designed to target specific genetic markers common in both Stellarian royal lineages and genetically modified humans." The display shifted to show spread projections across star systems. "According to these models, this pathogen will begin affecting key systems within 5 years. Within 20, it could collapse the neural capabilities of the entire Stellarian species and similarly affected human populations." The council chamber erupted into chaos until Queen Nix's voice cut through the din. "Who would create such a weapon?" "Those who benefit from division between our species," Adrian replied. "I traced financial and communication records through the archives. Elements of the Galactic Mercantile Guild have been funding research into targeted pathogens for decades." A council member stood abruptly. "These are serious accusations against our primary trading partner." "They are substantiated accusations," Adrian countered, revealing another layer of data. "Guild leadership has been systematically purchasing control of key pharmaceutical production facilities across 3 sectors. They're positioning themselves to be the only source of treatment once the pathogen is released." The Queen's eyes narrowed, starfields darkening. "And the connection to your unusual preservation?" Adrian focused on her directly. "The genetic modifications made to me weren't just for adaptation. They created a template for immunity to this specific pathogen, a pathogen that couldn't be manufactured until technologies developed thousands of years after my time." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Someone in my era saw this coming, predicted not just alien contact, but the specific biological vulnerability our species would share. They created me as a living vaccine blueprint." Lyra stepped forward, adding her scientific authority. "I've verified these claims. The human cellular structure contains novel protein configurations that would render the pathogen inert." For several moments, the chamber remained utterly silent. Then Queen Nix spoke, her voice resonating with controlled fury. "Council members Drevik, Sento, and Alanis, you will remain. The rest are dismissed while we verify these claims." When no one moved, her tendrils flared with bioluminescent warning. "Now." As the chamber cleared, Adrian noticed how 3 council members appeared particularly disturbed, exchanging nervous glances. When only the Queen's trusted advisors remained, she turned to Adrian, dropping all formality. You risked much bringing this directly to the council. There are clearly traitors among them. I needed to force their hand, Adrian explained. The only way to identify who's involved is to see who panics when their plan is exposed. Nick studied him with newfound appreciation. You understand political maneuvering better than expected for a scientist. 10,000 years ago, securing research funding required similar skills, Adrian replied with a wry smile. The Queen moved closer, lowering her voice. This connection between us, it was engineered across millennia. Does that disturb you? Adrian considered the question carefully. What disturbs me is being used as a pawn in someone else's game, even my descendants. What matters now is what we choose to do with this information. Her starfield eyes searched his. And what would you choose, Adrian Novak? To work with you to develop a vaccine for my genetic material. To expose those responsible. And to establish a genuine alliance between our peoples, not one founded on political expedience or genetic necessity, but on mutual respect. For the first time since they'd met, Adrian saw genuine surprise in the Queen's expression. You continue to adapt in unexpected ways, she said softly. Perhaps that is why you were chosen. Before Adrian could respond, alarms blared throughout the chamber. Thalo rushed in, his usually composed demeanor shattered. Your Majesty. Council members Drevik and Sento have fled the station. They've transmitted encrypted communications to guild vessels in the outer system. Nix's expression hardened. They've accelerated their timeline. Prepare my ship. She turned to Adrian, extending her hand in a very human gesture. It seems our conspiracy has become a crisis. Will you stand with me, Temporal Ambassador? Adrian took her hand without hesitation. I've come 10,000 years for this moment, Your Majesty. I'm not backing out now. The observation deck of the royal vessel, Eternal Dawn, offered a panoramic view of Earth and its orbital installations as the diplomatic fleet prepared to depart. Adrian stood at the viewing portal, palm pressed against the transparent material that separated him from the vacuum of space. 3 months had passed since the confrontation in the council chamber, 3 months of frantic scientific work, political maneuvering, and unexpected personal discoveries. Lost in thought again? Queen Nix's voice came from behind him, the harmonic undertones he once found alien now familiar and comforting. Adrian turned to face her. The Queen had foregone her formal regalia, dressed instead in the practical attire she preferred when not performing official duties. Her tendrils floated in a pattern he had come to recognize as contentment. Just saying goodbye, he replied. I never expected to see Earth again after entering cryostasis, let alone leave it a second time. Nix moved beside him, gazing at the blue planet. You could stay. The diplomatic corps would welcome your expertise. And miss the official presentation of the Novak Stellarian Immunity Protocol to the Galactic Concord? Adrian smiled. Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on your scientists. They still think human biological systems are charmingly primitive. The Queen's laughter chimed through the chamber. They're not wrong. A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched a shuttle depart from the orbital platform, carrying the last of the diplomatic staff to the surface. The guild representatives have formally surrendered all research related to the pathogen, Nick said finally. Their leadership faces tribunal next month. And the conspirators from your council? Drevik committed ritual dissolution rather than face judgment. Her expression darkened. Sento awaits sentencing for treason against the Confederation. Adrian nodded solemnly. The conspiracy had run deeper than either of them initially suspected, with tentacles reaching into both human and Stellarian governments. What had begun as a guild plot to control pandemic response had evolved over centuries into a scheme to ensure Stellarian dependency on human-controlled medical technologies, and vice versa. Your descendant was remarkably prescient, Nix observed, referencing Eleanor Novak's journals that had proven crucial to developing the immunity protocol. To engineer a solution millennia before the problem fully manifested. She had help, Adrian reminded her, thinking of the encrypted passages they discovered suggesting cooperation with early Stellarian explorers who had visited Earth in secret. Our peoples have been connected longer than either civilization acknowledges. The ship's ambient intelligence announced, departure sequence initiating. All personnel secure for transition to hyperspace. Nix turned to face Adrian fully, her expression unusually hesitant. The formal consort selection ceremony awaits our return to the homeworld. The unasked question hung between them. Adrian took her hands in his, a gesture that would have scandalized the court but had become natural between them during their late nights working side by side in the laboratory. When you first proposed our union, it was political and biological necessity. Now it is something else entirely, she finished, the starfields in her eyes brightening. Something neither of our species has vocabulary to properly express. Adrian laughed softly. 10,000 years of linguistic evolution, and we still struggle with the simplest human concept. Connection. Is that what this is? She asked, her tendrils gently brushing against his face in the intimate gesture they had developed. Connection across time, across species, across the void between stars, Adrian confirmed. My genes were engineered for adaptability, but no one anticipated how that adaptability would extend to my heart. The ship hummed around them as the engines engaged, preparing to carry them across the galaxy to the Stellarian homeworld. I accept your proposal, Adrian said formally, then added with a smile, though I suspect the Royal Council will need significant convincing that a 10,000-year-old human makes a suitable consort for their queen. They have already been overruled, Nix replied with imperial certainty. Our union transcends traditional political alliances. We are creating something unprecedented, a true bridge between our civilizations. The stars outside the viewport began to elongate as the ship prepared for hyperspace transition. Adrian felt the familiar sensation of his world transforming once again, but this time he wasn't alone in the journey. What will you tell them, he asked, when they ask why you chose me? Nix considered this, her tendrils forming the pattern that indicated her deepest sincerity. I will tell them that the universe conspired across 10 millennia to bring together two beings perfectly adapted to each other's needs. That what began as biological compatibility became intellectual resonance, and finally, something our scientists cannot quantify but our poets have always understood. And what do Stellarian poets call it? Adrian asked as the ship surged forward, carrying them toward their shared future. The Queen's answer came as the stars blurred into streaks of light around them, her harmonics resonating with an emotion that required no translation across species or time. The same thing yours do, temporal ambassador. They call it love. As the eternal dawn breached the boundaries of normal space, Adrian embraced his unlikely partner, no longer an ancient human or a specimen or even an ambassador, but something entirely new, a bridge between worlds, forged in the crucible of conspiracy and crisis, tempered by understanding and respect, and finally transformed by the most adaptable force in any galaxy. The capacity to find connection in the most unexpected places. The ship carried them onward, not just to the Stellarian homeworld but to a future neither of their species could have navigated alone, a future where the boundaries between them dissolve like the artificial divisions of 10,000 years, leaving only the shared journey into the unknown stars ahead.